Let's go ahead and get started. If you don't have a handout, there are some more on the back table there. We are going to get into the text of Job itself. So last week we did an overview of the book. This week we're going to get into the text. So you have, first thing here is an outline of the passage. I left some space so that we could write stuff down if you need to, which just means I took away my notes, so y'all don't get my notes on that. So, all right, let's go ahead and read the first 5 verses of Job. Today I've got a New King James for this one, so y'all do whatever you got. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. And 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. Also his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household, so that this man was the greatest of all the people in the east. And his sons would go and feast in their houses, each on his appointed day, and would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. So it was, when the days of feasting had run their course, that Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did regularly. So we've got this description of Job, and specifically we're talking about his integrity. Let's look at a couple words here. First, he's described as being blameless. This is verse 1. He's blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. So obviously, as we go through the text, we see this is not saying at all that Job is sinless. We know much better than that. But blameless here, what this is indicating is that Job is really the same on the inside as on the out. He's genuine. He's not two-faced. What you get is what you see. Upright, he behaves the way he's supposed to behave. He does the right thing with people and with God. And then one who fears God and turns away from evil. That's some of those characteristics we see in Proverbs of the wise man. So here's someone who really we can say he's walking in the light. Job is doing what he's supposed to do. And then we get to this description of his sons and his daughters, the possessions, the animals, the household. We've talked about how, though this section is all prose, we talked about this last week. The first 2 chapters are all prose. This really is one of those poetic wisdom books. And we see some of that in the way that his household is presented here. These are all numbers that have significance in the Hebrew Bible, right? These are not just random numbers. And so he's got seven sons, 3 daughters, total of 10 children, 7, 3, 10. These are all very typical symbolic numbers we see in the Old Testament. 7 being completion. 3 is typically a spiritual number. 10 is representing kind of humanity, because humans have 10 fingers, 10 toes, that sort of thing. So then we have 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yokes of oxen, 500 female donkeys. 5 is also one of those numbers you see a lot of times. So we see his greatness, but this is not saying at all that any of this is untrue, but even in the numbers we see a certain poetry there, is what I'm saying. That even the numbers of his people. So we get to his children, and they're partying. We talked about this a bit last week. The sons kind of rotate who's going to hold the feast, and they invite their brothers and their sisters. And then when they're done, verse 5, when the days of feasting had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them. He would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did regularly. So what's he worried about with his children? What's his concern when it comes to his kids? So he's concerned about their hearts. He's concerned there may be some secret sin going on. I heard something over here. I didn't hear what y'all said though. Maybe they've sinned against God, and so what does he do? He does sacrifice. Well, real quick before we get to that, this is one of those weird turns of phrase in Job. That word "cursed" there in the English, the Hebrew is actually blessed. It's like a euphemism. When they say they kind of like, when I was a kid, a fat kid they'd call tiny or something like that. It's that kind of euphemism. Something along the lines of, blessed is kind of like, oh yeah, they're blessing over here. So, but that's some sarcasm. That's kind of the again, some of that turn of phrase we're going to see in Job. Every English Bible I looked at properly gives it in English as cursed because that's really what they're getting across. But most have a footnote saying that it is blessed as well. So he goes and gives a sacrifice. Here's a question that came up among some of the folks I was reading and listening to as preparing this. They said, wait a minute, if we talked about last week how Job is most likely taking place in the time of the patriarchs, maybe this is the oldest written book of the Bible. That's a common thought. So if this is before the law of Moses, how would he know about doing a sacrifice for sin? How would y'all answer that? I've got an answer, but I want to hear what you guys have to say.
The Holy Spirit inspired it.
So maybe he knows through the Holy Spirit. Do we see sacrifices before the law of Moses? Cain and Abel, like from the very beginning. That's right. That's exactly right. It's just humans know that's how you do things. That's how you worship, is through sacrifice. And so yeah, all the way back to the first family, we do have sacrifice. We don't need the law of Moses for this. Now, the law of Moses gives us a lot of very specific ceremonial regulations for doing those sacrifices, but everybody always knew that you sacrifice if you're going to worship God, and you sacrifice in propitiation. The sacrifices were always pointing to that greater sacrifice of our Lord Jesus, even if they didn't know about it. So all of these things are showing Job's character, Job's integrity. What would y'all say, kind of, if you were going to describe Job here? Anything you would add to this? What do we think about Job now that we've seen him described at first? He feared God. And we know from Proverbs that's the beginning of wisdom, right?
I'm interested. He was obviously, he said he's the greatest man the East there.
Yeah.
All the people of the East, so he was, he was well known. He was high position. He was very prosperous. Even in that position, he recognized.
Even as being prosperous in the high position, he recognizes God. That's important. We see that in the Old Testament from other people, right? Abraham's kind of like that. But we don't always see that. I mean, remember, what was it towards the end of Proverbs? He says, Lord, don't give me riches or poverty, because if I'm rich, I might forget about you, right? If I'm poor, I might do something that brings dishonor to your name. Just let me be in the middle where things are okay. Like, I relate to that guy. Right? That's how I'm like. Just keep us in the middle. Okay. Verse 6, we get into the first test. So now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan, remember last week we said this is a title here, the Satan, also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, Behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Let's stop there real quick before we start to see him losing all of his stuff. I gave you at the top of this an alternate theme. We talked about a couple of potential themes last week, and this one comes from Christopher Ash, who did a really good commentary on there, and he's the one that in the How Help Me Teach the Bible podcast, he was the one that was being interviewed on Job, and he mentioned one of his friends sums up Job. The theme of Job is, how does God treat his friends? Who's bringing up the issue of Job here? God brings it up. God brings it up. He brings Job to Satan's attention. That's very interesting. And so, what's the substance of Satan's accusation here?
You know, Father, it struck me just as you were saying that God, it may indicate one of Satan's purposes. He's watching and looking for people who fear God in order to try them and tempt them or accuse them or do something. It could be one of his, could be indicate his
kind of a role. Yeah, so, and we talked about this a bit last week. Remember the word Satan means accuser or adversary. It's basically the district attorney in God's court is what his role is here. That doesn't mean that he's not the enemy that we see in the New Testament, but that means the way he's presented here is really fulfilling that role of being the one that brings accusations, that does the testing, that's going to stand against God's people and say, okay, is this person really what they're cracked up to be?
It struck me that it's a broader picture maybe than just Job.
Yeah, there's a bigger thing here. Yeah, so what's the substance of Satan's accusation?
I think you don't need to obey God, get all that blessing.
Hey, yeah, Job's only obedient because he's getting blessed. He's in it for himself. This is transactional. He's just like one of the pagans, and you're treating him good for it.
It can be broken very easily.
Oh, and yeah, all it would take is just a little bit, and we'll break this guy. Yeah. That really is what it's about. He's saying, Job's not in this for you, God. He's in it for himself. And you blessing him doesn't show anything. By the way, we have here a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. This phrase, sons of God, we find that from time to time in the Old Testament, speaking of kind of the heavenly court. And we touched on this a little bit last week, but the picture that we get from the Old Testament is that there are these powers that are superhuman, but they're subdivine. So this is not like the pagan pantheons where you've got a chief god who basically just beat all the other guys up and got to the top, or or is the oldest son or something like that. It's not like that. This is not Zeus on Mount Olympus. But we have this kind of in-between level of power. They're less than God in their power, but they are still superhuman. And the cosmology we get, at least in some of the Old Testament, is that God has delegated a certain amount of authority to these beings, these sons of God. Sons here is in Middle Eastern and Eastern phraseology, it's not uncommon for a subordinate to refer to their superior as their father. Did you guys ever read C.S. Lewis's The Horse and His Boy? You remember all the Calormens? They're supposed to be kind of quasi-Arabic. They're very Eastern in their culture. What do the lesser officers call the greater officers? Call their generals my father. And so that's part of what this kind of thing is is referencing here, is that the God as the one who's in charge of everything, the Lord as the creator, is in a sense their father. This is not speaking the unique sonship that our Lord has, or even this sonship that we're adopted into. But this is a common phrase we do find in the Old Testament referring to these angelic beings. So subdivine but superhuman, and in some way they're governing the world. The Satan's the adversary, and he's saying, is there anyone on earth who actually believes, or are they just in it for themselves? And so we have now then the suffering, verse 13. Oh, notice before we get there, the parameters that God puts on Satan's attack. Satan's not just given carte blanche. He's limited in what he can do. And that's important. We don't ever want to see the enemy of our souls as God's opposite. That's not the way it is. We are not dualists. The Satan is just another one of those spiritual beings, another one of those angelic beings, and he can only go as far as God lets him. Okay, verse 13. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. Oof, I'll have to push through. And the messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them when the Sabeans raided them and took them away. Indeed, they have killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands, raided the camels and took them away. Yes, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you. Then that is a bad day. We've got natural disasters. We've got terrorist attacks. Everything is bad one after another, right? And then what does Job say? He says, verse 20, then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin, nor charge God with wrong. So, does Job pass the test? So far, so good, right? So far, so good. There's a verse I put there from 4 verses from 1 Peter 4. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or thief or an evildoer or as a meddler, I like that. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. Suffering is part of life. We have a bad day and we think, oh, this was an unusual thing. I can't believe God would do this to me. No, actually, the bad day is normal because we have something better that we look forward to. Indeed, Christ himself suffered, and so we do the same. And Job's suffering is a hint at that as well. Okay, so far Job passes the test. He actually worships. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. He says, all of this stuff, it's not mine anyway. I don't deserve this. This is all a gift of God. That's an important part. But we get more. Chapter 2. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, from where do you come? So Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it. Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil, and still he holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without a cause?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and touch his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took for himself a potsherd with which to scrape himself while he sat in the midst of the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So Satan says, skin for skin. It doesn't matter as long as he has his health. And you know what? There's some truth to that, right? You don't have your health, what do you have, right? That's a common way of looking at things. The stuff, it doesn't matter. Attack his health. That's going to show Job's real character. And so Job is afflicted, painful boils, and the Lord says you can afflict him, but you can't kill him. You'd almost wish that God would have let him kill him. It would have been better for Job, right? That's at least Job's thinking that probably. Sometimes it's a lot worse to suffer than to have the ultimate. But still, Job's wife. Let's get to her. She says, "You still hold fast your integrity. Curse God and die." What do you think about this woman here? Yeah, she's not quite as godly as Job is there. No, she's not. That is a very human response. Yeah, that's true. And sometimes it's a lot easier to be the sufferer than to be with the person that's suffering, because hey, I can, it'd be better if I can take this on myself rather than have to be alongside someone that you love. So that may be part of what's going on here, and it might just be that she is more foolish. But we have that contrast, right? Job is described as fear God, shun evil, the description of the wise man, but she seems to be not so, at least not in this picture. And we're probably seeing her at her worst, but that's all we get to see her for, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. So you think she's feeling for him on this, and she's reacting from her concern for him. Just curse God and die. Yeah, and there's a sense where I think we could be more sympathetic if she had left off the cursing God part. But yeah, that's she's probably trying to be comforting, but I don't think it's too terribly comforting, unfortunately. Maybe she's a preview of the friends. Well, speaking of the friends, let's look at them. Verse 11, we only got about 5 minutes left, 6 minutes left, so we'll get through this. And then we'll get next week into Job's response, chapter 3. Now, when Job's 3 friends heard of all all this adversity that had come upon him, each one came from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, for they had made an appointment together to come and mourn with him and to comfort him. And when they raised their eyes from afar and did not recognize him, they lifted their voices and wept, and each one tore his robe and sprinkled dust on his head toward heaven. So they sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great. So they're coming to try to comfort him, right? To commiserate. Verse 12, when they see how bad it was, that's when they each kind of go into formal mourning. They tear their robe, they weep, they put ashes on their head, and they sit down in silence for 7 days. So we often will look at this. We talked about this last week a bit again. So there's just so much good stuff in the first 2 chapters that it's hard not to, in the overview, touch on a lot of it. But so they sit in silence, and we kind of say, you know what, that's not a bad response. I mean, that's kind of therapeutic there. You don't start giving advice, just sit there in silence. And then maybe that's what's going on. I mean, that's certainly in our more therapeutic way we look at things, we would see that as pretty good. On the other hand, in Jewish culture, and even Jewish culture back then, 7 days of silence is what you do with a corpse. It's sit in Shiva. And tearing your robes and throwing ashes on your head, that's what you do when you're in mourning because someone's dead. So maybe these guys are basically saying, okay, bring the coffin. He's not long for this world. Maybe not. It's ambiguous, right? His friends, they intend to comfort him, but the kinds of things they're doing are what you do with a corpse. So yeah, his grief is very great. Maybe they're just saying, like his wife did, okay, it's time to give up, man. Time to take what it is and give up. Or maybe they are commiserating. Maybe his wife is speaking out of her grief for her husband. And we're going to get into what happens with these guys starting in next week. So we're going to leave it there. This is not a great place to leave, but we're going to leave it there because that's where the text does. Next week, we're going to get into chapter 3. So look at chapter 3. This is Job's his own lamentation for what's happened to him. This isn't really the opening of the discussion. This is Job kind of venting before his friends start talking, right? So let's look at chapter 3 by itself. The following week, we're not going to go through everything that happens in the next several chapters with Job and his friends, but we're going to look at some kind of representative chapters of his friends. So next week, we're going to look at Job's birth, or I'm sorry, not Job's birth, Job's lament. The following week, we're going to look at the friends. The week after that, we're going to look at Job's response to his friends, and then we'll see what happens from there. Let's go ahead and we can have like maybe one question, one comment. Euphoma, you got it. Yeah. 40 is, yeah. So some of the common biblical numbers, 3 tends to be a number of the spiritual realm. And then it's multiples thereof. 4 is often the number of the physical realm. And the idea there is there's 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, that sort of thing. The 3, I mean, from a New Testament perspective, we could say the Trinity. How that works in the Old Testament is another, maybe it's just a hint towards that. I don't know. But 3 does tend to be the spiritual realm. 4 is the physical realm. 7 is completion, 4 plus 3, right? 12 is the number for the people of God, 4 times 3, right? 10 is the number of humanity because we got 10 fingers, 10 toes, and then the multiples thereof. 5, and I think 5 is just kind of another instance of 10. It's similar. It's similar to that. I can't remember off the top of my head. And then 40 is part of that fullness of the physical. 40 days, 40 nights, 40 years in the wilderness. 40 Jesus fasting for 40 days in the desert. Moses fasting for 40 days. It's kind of a connection with that God is breaking through into the physical world. But there's a lot of other ones, and some of that's a little speculative, but that's what most Most scholars would say that's what those numbers are, at least they seem to represent. We don't have that explained directly in the Bible, but that does seem to be the pattern. All right, we are slightly over time, so I'll see you all in service or next week as the case may be. God bless.